Good day to each and all of you, and a warm welcome, lovers of architecture, design, and the built environment, who have gathered here today at 130 East 64th Street in New York City to honor and celebrate one of America's significant architects, Edward Durell Stone, at the site of a house that he redesigned and lived in. I'm Barbara Lee Diamondstein Spielvogel, the chair of the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center, the creators of the Cultural Medallion program. Today we will install a cultural medallion at this very site. Cultural medallions are porcelainized enamel plaques affixed to the exterior of buildings. Throughout New York City, they commemorate an individual or an occurrence that has made a significant contribution to New York City's rich cultural heritage. And they create a sense of pride in history and of place among New Yorkers and visitors alike. The medallions are placed on existing buildings associated with distinguished New Yorkers from the arts, the law, business, education, sports, politics, public service, and so on. Most of these people or events are nominated for inclusion by members of the public, and I hope each of you will do that today as well. Edward Durell Stone was one of the earliest American exponents of the international style and had a major impact upon architectural education in the United States during the 1950s. He helped transform the international style modernism of the 1950s to the postmodernism of the 1960s and 1970s by substituting formalism for functionalism. Stone introduced traditional Arab motifs, as you can see readily in the facade of the building behind me, including lacy grilled patterns and applied grill work to many of his buildings. He was born in Fayetteville, Arkansas on March 9, 1902, so last week was the 110th anniversary of his birth. In the 1950s, his austere modernism was replaced by ornate formality, exemplified by his design of the United States Embassy in New Delhi, India. And for the next 20 years, Stone designed buildings that were intended to reflect what he viewed as universal and timeless values. And according to his son, architect Hick Stone, who was meant to be with us today, he practiced architecture as an individual rather than as a school of thought. His work spanned a number of eras. Trained in the Beaux-Arts, he practiced modernism and the international style and synthesized Wrightian forms. Our speakers today are the distinguished architect, Robert A.M. Stern, and the chief curator of architecture and design of the Museum of Modern Art, a newcomer to New York from Portugal, Pedro Gadanho, and we wish him a warm welcome and a long tenure. Now it is my pleasure to begin with Pedro Gadanho. Please.
So, good morning. I'm here actually on behalf of the chief curator of the Department of Architecture and Design at MoMA, Barry Bergdahl, because unfortunately he's traveling in Europe at this moment, researching for exhibitions. And so I was appointed to be here representing not only himself but also MoMA. I think especially because there is obviously this historical tie in between MoMA itself as an institution represented in the city by a building of Edward Durell Stone. So in fact, it's, I think, highly significant that we may speak here of this relationship and of this representation of modernism in the city of New York, as is the case in the celebration and this consecration of this building with the Medallion. So in fact, as a newcomer to New York, my immediate reaction to the building is in fact that this is part of this diversity and beauty of New York as being a juxtaposition of very different moments in history, very different styles. And I think this is what makes New York truly attractive as a big metropolis. And the fact that we are recognizing these different aspects of New York architecture, and that we are preserving these very different aspects and moments in time in this collage of history within the city, I think is what we should also celebrate in this very moment. And in fact, talking about diversity, my first recollections when looking at the facade and reading the history of what it brought it into being here, for me the most interesting aspect was that in fact I recognized this brand of modernism from my trips in Vietnam, of all places. Because in Vietnam during the 60s there was this intricate, almost Baroque work on the grills with modernism because of sunlight. And so the fact that after his experience with the New Delhi embassy, the fact that Edward Durlstone brings his experience in another part of the world onto New York and onto the fabric of the city here, I think it's highly poetical and highly significant of New York also as a cultural recipient of histories from all over the world. So this is what I would like to very shortly remember and also evoke in terms of the celebration. I'm sure Mr. Robert Stern will have a lot more to say on this, so I only want to thank you for the invitation to be here and give these few words, and only express really my pride in being here representing MoMA in recognizing this modern landmark. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro Godano. And as some of you may know, Edward Durlstone had a very significant role at the Museum of Modern Art and its building, and I'm sure Robert Stern will tell you more about that. Robert Stern, practicing architect,
Just throw my speech away.
teacher and writer, is also Dean of the Yale School of Architecture and a committed preservationist. Before returning to Yale, where he earned his Master of Architecture degree in 1965, he was director of the Historic Preservation Program at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. Robert Stern is one of the foremost historians of New York City's architecture and urbanism. He is also the co-author of the widely admired New York book series, and an early and strong advocate for the preservation of 20th century buildings. In fact, his 35 Modern Landmarks in Waiting was published in the New York Times in November 1996. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the prize-winning architect, author, savant, all-around commentator, Robert A.M. Stern.
Thank you, Barbara Lee. I didn't write the speech Barbara Lee wanted, but I will remind everyone that Ed Stone was the architect with Philip Goodwin of the first building of the Museum of Modern Art. And he was, even before that, he trained, his first major commission was as the interior design architect for Radio City Music Hall. And he also designed two very important international style houses, a Mandel House and I think Mount Kisco, if I recall, and the Conger Goodyear House, which has been saved in through a great deal of effort in Westbury, Long Island. So he was, as they say, a player in the international style. And then I will say that he then took up the language of Frank Lloyd Wright. And then, of course, because all good things happen at Yale, he was chief critic of architecture for quite a number of years at Yale in the 1940s, before going on to an extremely he served in the military in the Second World War, and then before going on to a very successful career as a major architect. You may also know his General Motors building, the big building above the Apple store on Fifth Avenue. And there are other buildings that we could talk about. But of course, in these situations, I only like to talk about myself being an architect. So this is a day of reckoning for me, because once upon a time when I was a student at Yale, a Callow architecture student, I wrote an essay criticizing. I had an idea I would be an architectural critic. For 2 minutes, I got over it. Criticizing this very townhouse for the same reasons that today I applaud it. Fortunately, my essay was never published, but I do have a copy of it. In 1964, I objected to Edward Durrell Stone's modifications to the Victorian brownstone. He had been converted to a family home in 1958. So I was already behind the times, as you can see. And which I felt was standoffish and self-consciously assertive. But beyond that, I felt it misunderstood the premise of the context. As I saw it then, this block, and I still see it that way, it was a consummate New York townhouse block. But the scale of each individual house, as well as Philip Johnson's underappreciated Asia Society, just down the street at number 112, speak collectively of urbanity then as now. Ed Stone's facade seemed more an unwelcome interloper, at least to me then, speaking only to itself. Ed Stone was a very good architect, as I hope we all know, and but like each of us, he was a product of his moment in time. In his case, that moment held the Victorian era in contempt. It also dismissed contextual responsibility as sentimental nostalgia. In his 1962 autobiography, The Evolution of an Architect, Stone wrote, I bought an old brownstone circa 1875, undistinguished and drab. One afternoon in California, he really meant to say sunny California, but he didn't. I redesigned it. I stripped off the ancient, depressing face of the building and put in glass all the way to the top. Then over the glass and some 12 inches in front of it, I built a concrete grill, essentially for privacy. Of course, if he didn't have the glass, he wouldn't have had the privacy problem. It lights the interiors and enables us to see out without being observed by passers-by. In my opinion, the grill is the perfect solution, this is Stone still speaking, to the problem of privacy in the lower floors of apartments and townhouses. End of quote. Well, as we say, that was then and this is now. Stone's explanation seems a bit out of touch with today's thinking, but even more significantly, it was, a bit out of touch with the advanced thinking of his own time. 1 year after Stone defended his bit of facade-ectomy, New Yorkers, shocked by the decision to tear down Pennsylvania Station, began to realize how much the Victorian age had added to our city. Suddenly, Stone's facade seemed very, very wrong. In fact, this facade still bothers me. I only would be out here probably for Barbara Lee, but and for Andrew Kogan. But for better or for worse, it's an important fact of history, and as such needs to be respected. When I wrote my essay, I thought Stone's clip-on facade failed to convey a sense of permanence. How wrong I was. The screen was gone for a while, some of you may recall, but now it's back, protected and perhaps even loved, certainly by Andrew Kogan and his family, who've chosen to make their home behind it. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to the Stone family for putting back the pieces. And thank you, Barbara Lee, for celebrating its importance. And thank you to all whose efforts have ensured that Ed Stone's townhouse is here to stay.
And thank you, Robert A.M. Stern. A special thanks to the faithful stewards of this house, Andrew Cogan and his wife, Lori Finkel, and his children, some of whom are here today. We're glad you're here. If any of you have verifiable information of any persons who have made remarkable contributions and New Yorkers who lived, worked, and created in New York City for a significant period of time in a still standing building, no phantoms please, that is not a designated landmark, we would like to hear from you. To learn more about our program, please see HLPC culturalmedallions.org or fill out one of the forms that will be distributed and return it to me. Or please send your, why don't you distribute them? Or please send your nominations to barcar720@aol.com. We look forward to hearing from you, and I thank each and all of you for coming today, and thank Mr. and Mrs. Cogan and family for their warm hospitality. And now what we have to do is unveil the cultural medallion. So Caleb and Andrew, will you come forward, please? And I will read the text as you undo it. Shra, Edward Durrell Stone, 1862 to 1937, 130 East 64th Street. Architect Edward Durrell Stone was a pioneering American modernist who designed the Museum of Modern Art, co-design, 1939, in association with Philip Goodwin. Stone later rejected the austerity of modernism and sought to create a warmer, more decorative modern architecture in projects such as the United States Embassy in New Delhi, India, the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in New Delhi was 1954, the JFK Center for the Performing Arts in Washington, 1959, the former Gallery of Modern Art, 1958, on Columbus Circle, and the General Motors Building, 1967, on Fifth Avenue. And this townhouse, which he renovated in 1956, and where he lived until 1964. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Mr. Cogan, Mr. Medallion, Mr. Stern. And please feel free to nominate future appropriate persons. Thank you.